Okay, so we have just started EQing the instruments, and so far we've only EQ'd the bass and the kick drum. And we had those soloed out so we could kind of hear what was going on. I know this seems like it's taken forever, and in a live sound context, you're like, how in the world do I do that fast? But you can do things pretty quickly, especially if you have a Thursday night practice to work on getting everything ready. So this is just the kick and the bass, which we've EQ'd. And we'll add in the rest of the drum kit. And it turns out I did have the EQ on for the room. And this is for the room sound, which is like the rest of the kit. If you feel like that's muddy or not cutting through, sometimes you can boost up here just a little bit. You have this energy that you can boost. That's an extreme example. You would never use that much, but it shows you what's going on at the different frequencies. Up here, you have like air and sizzle. Here, you have like more of a presence, but it can be a little bit too brittle. Here, it's just kind of mid-rangey-ish. You wouldn't use that. So if you're trying to get cymbals to bite just a little bit more, you can boost them up here and see what they sound like. That's a little bit too again, brittle for me. And sometimes if they're too harsh already, you can bring stuff down. You can always cut. Typically, you cut to make things sound better, and you boost to make things sound different. That's my understanding. So we have kind of a drum kit now. We'll add the snare in because we haven't added that back yet. So there's the snare, and we'll go back and find the. We do have the EQ on for the snare. So here is what the snare would sound like without that. Here it's a little muddy. So typically, I like to bring the EQ way up so I can tell what's happening in different places, and you kind of sweep through and figure out what sounds good. And typically for the snare, you'll have some of the energy of it in the lower section. And some in the higher. These are very extreme boosts and cuts, by the way. You can do this a lot more surgically, where you turn that way down, that sort of thing. So do what works, and try not to have one thing fill up one whole section of the sonic spectrum, or whatever you call it. So let's go back and start adding in some other instruments. Let's add in the piano. And there's nothing on the piano here. What you typically do with instruments that are not the kick or the bass is you will roll off a certain amount of the low end. You'll do a low cut. A lot of people will do that around, well, they'll get rid of just about everything below maybe 120 or so. And the reason they do that is that the kick and the bass really need that space below 120, and if everything else is fighting for it also, it just kind of muddies things up. And sometimes you don't need to use any EQ at all. I think we could just maybe turn this up a little bit louder. It probably seems like the kick and the bass are very loud right now. But I promise you, when we add everybody else in, they will seem like they're going away. So let's add in a layered synth. We'll go back to the verse. And so we're turning the EQ on for the synth. And I'm going to turn the synth way up so we can hear it better. The EQ is off right now. I think I'm going to reset all this so you can hear why we do some of these things. So with the EQ off, hear how that's just a little bit muddy. If you listen to it, it sounds nice and warm alone, but typically you would get rid of everything below about 150. And you don't have a lot of spaces to boost. Like if you boost over here, it doesn't matter much because there's not much happening there. It just starts to sound like a air leak or something. Sometimes people will boost a little bit right about here if they need to warm things up around like 500, 3 to 500. The downside of that is it can kind of like swallow up the whole mix of the low mids if you do it wrong. So that's with the EQ in, that's with it off. And the reason you can't really hear it very well there, but if I had the bass in, you would hear how with the EQ off, it would fight against the synth layer. So you want to keep the bass and the kick clean. So you can kind of hear the difference. That's with the EQ on, that's with it off. It's a little bit murkier. And you're trying to get more definition out of everything with the equalization. And we'll go back in. Again, the ultimate thing is what does it sound like in context? So we'll start adding in some of these other instruments to see what things sound like in context. So now we know what it sounds like in context. And we can hear it real well, but we also know it's too loud. So once you've got it set and EQ'd right, you bring it back down to where it's comfortable but not louder than it should be. And now we'll move on to the B3 in a second.